When you strip away the Hollywood myths, the heavily sanitized memoirs, and the simplistic video game statistics, the Eastern Front of World War II was a brutal, unforgiving meat grinder that swallowed men and machines on a scale that completely defies human comprehension. We are talking about a theater of war where entire army groups simply ceased to exist in a matter of weeks, and where the outcome of the greatest and most destructive conflict in human history was ultimately decided in the mud, the snow, and the blood of millions. If you ask any armchair historian, seasoned military analyst, or combat veteran at the local VFW post which tank truly defined this apocalyptic struggle, you are going to get two immediate, violently opposed answers. In one corner, you have the Soviet T-34, the crude, brutally pragmatic, mass-produced sledgehammer that supposedly overwhelmed the enemy with sheer, unadulterated numbers. In the other corner, you have the German Panzerkampfwagen V, universally known as the Panther, a marvel of Teutonic engineering designed specifically to be the ultimate apex predator of the Russian steppes. But which of these steel beasts truly ruled the Eastern Front when the rubber met the road, or rather, when the steel met the frozen tundra? Welcome back to the channel, where we cut through the wartime propaganda and dissect military history with the cold, hard logic of tactics, logistics, firepower, and engineering. If you want to understand how wars are actually fought and won at the highest strategic levels, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and join the ranks of those who study the reality of combat. Now let us chamber around, check our optics, and dive into the deepest, most forensic analysis of the T-34 versus the Panther you will ever hear. To truly understand how these two radically different war machines ended up staring each other down across the vast expanses of the Soviet Union, we have to rewind the clock long before the first shots of Operation Barbarossa were fired in June of 1941. The supreme irony of the armored clash on the Eastern Front is that the roots of both Soviet and German tank doctrines were actually intertwined in a clandestine marriage of convenience decades earlier. Following the utter devastation of the First World War and the punishing restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, a demilitarized Germany and a globally isolated Soviet Union signed the Treaty of Rapallo in 1922. This diplomatic agreement led to the establishment of a secret joint tank testing and training facility known as the Kama Tank School, located deep inside Soviet territory near the city of Kazan. Throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s, German officers, who would later become the legendary architects of the Blitzkrieg, like Heinz Guderian, were practically swapping notes and sharing vodka with top-tier Soviet military theorists. The Germans were busy refining their concept of Bewegungskrieg, or maneuver warfare, focusing heavily on combined arms, two-way radio communication, and decentralized command to achieve rapid, paralyzing breakthroughs. The Soviets, under the brilliant and visionary Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, were simultaneously developing the massive sweeping doctrine known as deep battle. Deep battle was not just about punching a localized hole in the enemy trench line. It was about launching massive, echeloned, armored formations hundreds of miles into the enemy rear to completely shatter their logistical hubs and command infrastructure. But a military doctrine is absolutely nothing more than a piece of paper without the physical hardware required to execute it on the battlefield, and the Soviets found their missing technological link in a highly unlikely place, the United States of America. Enter John Walter Christie, a brilliant but incredibly eccentric American engineer whose revolutionary tank suspension system was largely ignored by the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, who were far too busy pinching pennies and fighting bureaucratic turf wars in the interwar years. Christie designed a unique suspension system utilizing large road wheels and incredibly long, independent coil springs that allowed for unprecedented cross-country speed and off-road mobility. The Soviets immediately recognized this American invention as the absolute key to unlocking the rapid exploitation phases of their deep battle doctrine. They purchased two unarmed Christie M9931 chassis, shipped them across the ocean to the Soviet Union under the fraudulent customs manifest of agricultural tractors, and used them as the genetic baseline for their BT series of fast cavalry tanks. But the BT tanks, while incredibly fast, had paper-thin armor and ran on highly flammable aviation gasoline, a fatal combination that was brutally exposed during the proxy battles of the Spanish Civil War and the fierce border clashes with the Imperial Japanese Army at Khalkhin Gol. The Soviet Tank Corps realized with terrifying clarity that they needed a new vehicle, one that combined the unmatched mobility of the Christie suspension with armor thick enough to stop modern anti-tank guns and a main gun big enough to bust enemy bunkers. This monumental engineering task fell to a brilliant chain-smoking designer named Mikhail Koshkin, working at the massive Kharkov locomotive factory. Koshkin vehemently pushed back against the conservative Soviet military brass, who wanted yet another wheeled-tracked hybrid vehicle, insisting instead on a pure-tracked design featuring heavily sloped armor, a concept that would fundamentally change armored warfare forever. Sloping the armor plate at an extreme angle of 60 degrees meant that a 45mm steel plate offered the ballistic equivalent of roughly 90 millimeters of vertical steel, while simultaneously increasing the probability of an incoming armor-piercing shell simply ricocheting off into the sky. To power this 32-ton beast, the Soviets had developed the legendary V2 diesel engine, a massive 38-liter aluminum block 12-cylinder power plant churning out a highly reliable 500 horsepower. Diesel fuel was far less prone to catastrophic explosive fires than high-octane gasoline when the fuel tanks were penetrated, and the highly efficient engine gave the new tank, officially designated the T-34, a staggering operational range of nearly 250 miles on a single tank of gas. Armed with a high-velocity 76, 2mm L11, and later the improved F-34 main gun, the T-34 was, on paper, the most perfectly balanced tank in the world when it entered mass production in 1940. Koshkin himself personally drove two of the early prototypes over 1,000 miles through the freezing Russian winter from Kharkov to Moscow, just to prove their mechanical reliability to Joseph Stalin, a heroic and grueling road trip that ultimately cost the chief engineer his life due to severe pneumonia. When Adolf Hitler unleashed over 3 million Axis troops across the Soviet border on June 22, 1941, the German panzer divisions were riding incredibly high on the fumes of their stunning operational victories in Poland and France. The backbone of the German armored thrust consisted primarily of Panzer II and Panzer IV tanks, armed with 37mm and short-tilled 75mm guns, which had proven perfectly adequate against the largely obsolete or poorly employed armor of Western Europe. But as the Wehrmacht drove deeper into the vast, unforgiving expanses of the Soviet Union, they ran headlong into the T-34, and the psychological and tactical shock of this encounter cannot be overstated. German anti-tank gunners watched in sheer, unadulterated horror as their standard 37mm armor-piercing shells simply bounced off the sloped glaze plates of the T-34 like harmless spitballs. In one incredibly famous engagement near the town of Mtsensk in October 1941, a handful of T-34s belonging to Mikhail Katukov's 4th Tank Brigade ambushed the elite German 4th Panzer Division, tearing through their ranks and leaving a trail of burning German armor in a brutal display of sheer technological superiority. The German infantry grimly nicknamed their own 37mm anti-tank gun the Army Door Knocker because all it did was politely announce its presence to the heavily armored Soviet crews sitting safely inside. So, what exactly does a highly industrialized, fiercely proud military machine do when it suddenly finds itself completely outgunned and out-armored by an enemy it had previously considered racially and technologically inferior? You might naturally think the most logical step would be to simply swallow their pride, reverse engineer the enemy's design, mass produce an exact copy, and throw it right back at them. In fact, General Heinz Guderian suggested exactly that, proposing that German factories just start building direct copies of the T-34 to quickly plug the gaping hole in their armored capabilities. But German national pride, coupled with the stark logistical reality that German industry severely lacked the specific raw materials like high-grade aluminum required for the massive diesel engines, made a direct one-to-one copy absolutely impossible. Instead, the German High Command ordered a special Panzer Commission to travel to the Eastern Front, study captured T-34s in meticulous detail, and develop a domestic answer that would not just match the Soviet tank, but utterly annihilate it from ranges where the Russians could not even return fire. This urgent directive sparked a fierce, high-stakes design competition between two German industrial heavyweights, Daimler-Benz and MAN. Daimler-Benz submitted the VK30 O2D, a design that looked suspiciously like a T-34 wearing a tailored German uniform, complete with a forward-mounted turret, heavily sloped armor, and a proposed diesel engine. But the competing MAN design, designated the VK30 O2M, was the distinctly German interpretation of armored warfare, featuring a rear-mounted turret, a highly complex torsion bar suspension utilizing overlapping road wheels, and a massive Maybach gasoline engine. Hitler, ever obsessed with the concept of superior firepower and impenetrable frontal armor, personally intervened and chose the MAN design, ordering it to be up-armored even further before production even began. This direct interference pushed the vehicle's combat weight from the originally planned 30 tons to a staggering 45 tons, a massive weight increase that would become the original sin of the Panther. This fatal compromise placed immense, continuous strain on a transmission and final drive system that were originally engineered for a significantly lighter vehicle, guaranteeing a legacy of mechanical unreliability. But despite its severe mechanical teething problems and tendency to spontaneously catch fire, the Panzerkampfwagen V Panther was a terrifying masterpiece of lethal engineering when it finally rolled off the assembly lines and onto the battlefield. Its frontal hull armor was 80 millimeters thick and sloped at an aggressive 55 degrees, making it practically invulnerable to the standard Soviet 76. 2-millimeter guns from the front at any combat range. But the true undisputed crown jewel of the Panther was Mason armament, the incredibly lethal 75mm Kubelke 42L70 gun. Do not let the seemingly standard caliber fool you into thinking it was a typical 75mm weapon like the one found on the American M4 Sherman tank. The L-70 designation meant the barrel was exactly 70 calibers long, an incredibly long steel tube that allowed the massive propellant charges to accelerate the armor-piercing projectile to a blister's muzzle velocity of over 3,000 feet per second. This phenomenal gun had a flatter trajectory and significantly higher armor penetration capabilities than even the legendary, feared 88mm gun mounted on the heavy Tiger I tank. A highly skilled German gunner, utilizing the superb TZF-12A binocular gun sight, could consistently put a high-velocity round straight through the front plate of a T-34 from well over a mile away, long before the blind Soviet crew even knew they were in the crosshairs. To truly evaluate the effectiveness of these two iconic machines, we have to pull back from the tactical crosshairs of the gunner's sight and look at the macro-level war of industrial logistics, because as the old military adage goes, amateurs talk tactics, but professionals study logistics. When the Germans invaded in 1941, the Soviet Union executed one of the most astonishing logistical miracles in human history, physically dismantling over 1,500 entire manufacturing plants and moving them on trains thousands of miles east. These vital factories were relocated beyond the Ural Mountains, safely out of reach of the strategic bombers of the German Luftwaffe, where they were rapidly reassembled in the freezing cold. Entire cities like Chelyabinsk and Nizhny Tagil were completely transformed into massive, sprawling military-industrial complexes, rightfully earning the legendary nickname Tankograd. In these freezing, often unheated factories, the Soviet workforce, consisting largely of determined women, teenagers, and the elderly, churned out T-34s at a rate that completely defied German intelligence estimates. The Soviet engineering philosophy was brutally pragmatic and ruthlessly efficient, stripping away every single luxury crew comfort and non-essential mechanical component to maximize the speed of the production line. The steel welds on a late-war T-34 were incredibly rough, ugly, and looked like they were done by a blindfolded amateur in a rush, but they held the thick armor plates together just long enough for the tank to do its bloody job. Why would any nation spend hundreds of precious man-hours polishing armor plates and refining the interior of a machine if the brutal mathematics of the Eastern Front dictate its inevitable doom? How long do you genuinely think a standard T-34 was actually designed to survive in high-intensity combat before being violently destroyed by enemy fire or suffering a catastrophic mechanical breakdown? The chilling, deeply uncomfortable truth is that Soviet military planners calculated the average combat lifespan of T-34 in late 1942 to be roughly 14 days, or the equivalent of surviving about 3 to 4 major tactical engagements. Therefore, designing a highly durable transmission that could last for thousands of miles, or installing comfortable padded seats for the crew, was considered an absolute unforgivable waste of precious national resources. The T-34 was designed to be the ultimate expendable military asset, functioning very much like the famous American Liberty ships that were rapidly welded together in a matter of weeks. Both were designed with one single overriding strategic purpose: to completely overwhelm the enemy's capacity to destroy them through sheer, unadulterated volume and relentless mass production. Contrast this brutal Soviet pragmatism with the German industrial war machine, which operated on a deeply ingrained philosophy of artisanal craftsmanship and excessive over-engineering that often bordered on the absurd. While the Soviets highly standardized their production lines to pump out thousands of nearly identical T-34s, the Germans were constantly tweaking, modifying, and upgrading the Panther mid-production on the factory floor. This constant tinkering meant that a Panther built in May might have completely different spare parts requirements than a Panther built in August, creating an absolute logistical nightmare for the quartermasters trying to keep these complex beasts running at the front. The Panther was built like an oversized, heavily armored Swiss watch, requiring highly skilled labor, precision machining, and increasingly scarce strategic materials to assemble properly. It is a fascinating historical parallel that we see even today in modern defense procurement, akin to comparing the rapid mass production of the rugged M4 Sherman to the highly complex, incredibly expensive, and maintenance-heavy development cycles of modern systems like the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter or the early M2 Bradley. The brilliant but ruthless German Minister of Armaments, Albert Worspear, tried desperately to rationalize and streamline this chaotic production process, often utilizing brutal slave labor from concentration camps, but the German industry simply could not outpace the sheer volume of the Allied factories. Furthermore, the harsh geographical reality of the Eastern Front heavily favored the rugged simplicity of the Soviet design over the delicate, high-maintenance complexity of the German machine. The German logistical umbilical cord stretched dangerously thin, running for over 1,000 miles from the heavy industrial factories in the Ruhr Valley, across occupied Poland, and deep into the trackless Russian steppes. To make matters infinitely worse, the Soviet railway network used a significantly wider track gauge than the rest of Western Europe, meaning the Germans had to either capture intact Soviet rolling stock or painstakingly convert thousands of miles of rail lines just to move their heavy tanks to the front. The Panther, weighing in at a massive 45 tons, was an absolute nightmare to transport, frequently breaking down standard rail cars and severely struggling to cross the primitive, low-capacity wooden bridges that dotted the rural Russian countryside. The T-34, weighing significantly less at 32 tons and sporting incredibly wide tracks, exerted far less ground pressure per square inch than a fully equipped infantryman walking on foot. This crucial design feature allowed the Soviet tanks to effortlessly glide over the infamous Rasputitsa, the deep-sucking mud seasons of spring and autumn that completely bogged down the heavier, narrower-tracked German panzers and halted entire offensives. The Panther's highly complex Shuttle-Laufwerk suspension, featuring dual, interleaved, and overlapping road wheels, provided an incredibly smooth ride that allowed for highly accurate fire on the move, but it came with a fatal environmental flaw. During the brutal Russian winter, the deep mud and slush of the day would pack tightly between the overlapping wheels of the Panther, and when the temperature plummeted at night, that mud would freeze as solid as concrete. German tank crews would frequently wake up to find their state-of-the-art Panthers completely immobilized, requiring them to light dangerous fires under the tank or use blowtorches just to thaw the suspension out before they could even move. Changing a damaged inner road wheel on a Panther required the crew to painstakingly remove multiple outer wheels first, a grueling, back-breaking maintenance test that could take hours in the freezing cold while under enemy artillery fire. The T-34, utilizing the simple, robust Christie suspension with large, independent road wheels, had none of these issues, allowing a minimally trained crew of peasant conscripts to keep the tank running with nothing more than a heavy sledgehammer and raw physical force. This monumental clash of industrial philosophies is certainly not without historical precedent, and any American veteran of the armored cavalry or student of military history can easily see the echoes of our own past in this struggle. During the American Civil War, the Confederacy often produced technologically superior, highly specialized weapons and possessed brilliant tactical commanders who could consistently win localized tactical victories against superior numbers. But the Union Army, backed by the heavily industrialized might of the North, standardized their military equipment, mass-produced their weapons, and heavily leveraged its superior logistical rail network to slowly, inevitably crush the South through sheer, grinding attrition. The Eastern Front of World War II was this exact same dynamic, but scaled up to a level of mechanized violence and sheer destruction that still staggers the human imagination today. The Germans purposefully built the Panther to win individual tactical duels, banking entirely on a high kill-to-death ratio to compensate for their severe lack of overall numbers. The Soviets, on the other hand, built the T-34 to win the macro-level war, fully accepting horrific, mind-numbing casualties as the necessary, unavoidable price of doing business in a ruthless war of total annihilation. We have now meticulously laid out the strategic blueprints. We have examined the freezing factory floors, and we have traced the vital logistical bloodlines that fed the greatest armored clash in human history. The massive stage is perfectly set, and the immense industrial engines of both the Third Reich and the Soviet Union are running at an absolute fever pitch, churning out thousands of these steel leviathans and rushing them to the front lines. But a heavy tank sitting flawlessly on a factory floor or riding smoothly on a rail car is absolutely nothing more than a very expensive, heavily armored paperweight. The true measure of these machines, the ultimate unforgiving test of the T-34's brutal simplicity against the Panther's lethal complexity, can only be accurately judged when the landing ramps drop, the thick diesel smoke clears, and the high explosive armor-piercing rounds start flying across the steppes. When these two radically opposing philosophies of war finally collided head-on in the massive, swirling tank battles of Kursk and the long, bloody road to Berlin, the harsh tactical realities on the ground would expose the fatal flaws and the hidden strengths of both designs in ways that neither side's engineers could have ever possibly predicted. Stepping off the production line and into the claustrophobic, deafening reality of armored combat, the stark differences between the T-34 and the Panther became a matter of immediate life and death for the men sealed inside these steel coffins. To truly grasp the tactical disparity between these two machines, we must look beyond the raw thickness of the armor plates and the muzzle velocity of the main guns, and dive deep into the critical realm of combat ergonomics and situational awareness. In the brutal calculus of mechanized warfare, the tank that fires the first accurate shot wins the engagement 9 times out of 10. Regardless of whose armor is thicker. The earliest iterations of the Soviet design, specifically the T-34 model 1941 and 1942, suffered from a catastrophic, deeply flawed turret layout that severely crippled its combat effectiveness in a fluid tactical environment. The Soviets utilized a two-man turret design, meaning the tank commander was also forced to act as the primary gunner. Imagine a modern American fighter pilot being stripped of his radar intercept officer, forced to fly the aircraft, manually track multiple bogies, calculate lead angles, and fire his weapons all at the exact same time, while looking through a dirty, scratched periscope. When a T-34 commander had his face pressed tightly against the rubber eyepiece of his telescopic sight to aim the 76.2mm gun, he was entirely blind to the rest of the battlefield. He could not spot flanking anti-tank guns, he could not coordinate with the rest of his platoon, and he could not anticipate enemy maneuvers. To compound this severe lack of situational awareness, the vast majority of early Soviet tanks were not equipped with two-way radios. The concept of widespread radio communication was deemed too expensive and technologically complex for the rapid mass production quotas demanded by Moscow. Instead, Soviet platoon commanders were forced to rely on naval-style signal flags to communicate with their wingmen. A commander would literally have to open his heavy steel hatch in the middle of a raging firefight, expose his head and shoulders to lethal shrapnel and sniper fire, and wave a brightly colored flag to order a simple change in formation. By the time the hatch opened and the flag was raised, the tactical situation had already changed, or a high explosive shell had permanently silenced the communication attempt. Inside the tank, the environment was a literal hellscape of deafening noise, choking cordite fumes and blinding darkness. The early T-34 lacked a turret basket, meaning the loader had to physically scramble over piles of highly explosive ammunition casings on the floor as the turret rotated, desperately trying to keep up with the gunner while avoiding having his limbs crushed by the heavy steel breech block. The raw, unpolished glass used in Soviet UPTs was notoriously poor, often plagued by a yellowish tint and internal bubbling that made identifying targets beyond 500 yards a near impossibility in less than perfect weather conditions. How does a crew fight effectively when they are practically blind, deaf, and completely isolated from the rest of their unit? The grim reality is that they often did not, which directly led to the staggering, almost incomprehensible loss rates of Soviet armor in the early years of the war. In stark contrast, the German Panther was designed from the ground up to be a highly synchronized hunter-killer platform that prioritized the cognitive bandwidth of its crew above almost all else. The Panther featured a spacious, brilliantly laid-out three-man turret, separating the critical roles of commander, gunner, and loader. The German tank commander sat highly elevated in a dedicated cupola equipped with multiple armored glass vision blocks, providing a clear, uninterrupted 360-degree view of the battlefield. His sole responsibility was to command the vehicle, spot enemy threats, and feed target coordinates to his gunner. This is the exact same highly successful crew dynamic that forms the backbone of modern American armored doctrine today, utilized in the M1 Abrams main battle tank. Every single Panther rolling off the assembly line was equipped with a high-quality Fuji-5 two-way radio and a highly reliable internal intercom system. The German crew fought as a unified, tightly integrated organism, capable of executing complex, decentralized and concentrating their fire with lethal precision. The optical superiority of the German war machine cannot be overstated. The Panther was equipped with the legendary Zeiss TZF-12A binocular gun sight, a masterpiece of optical engineering that provided crystal-clear magnification and a wide field of view. A German gunner looking through a Zeiss optic could easily distinguish the silhouette of a T-34 from a destroyed tractor at over 1.5 miles away. But the mechanical superiority of the Panther's interior came at a steep, often fatal cost in terms of overall reliability and maintenance. Driving a T-34 was an exercise in raw, punishing physical endurance. The Soviet tank utilized a primitive 4-speed crash gearbox with no synchromesh, meaning the driver had to perfectly match the engine revolutions to shift gears. In the terrifying heat of battle, this was nearly impossible, and T-34 drivers famously kept a heavy steel sledgehammer right next to their seat. When the transmission stubbornly refused to shift, the driver would literally beat the gear lever into place with the sledgehammer. It was crude, it was physically agonizing, but it worked in the mud and the blood. The Panther, conversely, utilized a highly advanced hydraulically assisted steering system and a sophisticated synchromesh transmission. A German teenager with minimal training could drive the massive 45-ton Panther with just 2 fingers, steering it smoothly and effortlessly across the battlefield. But this incredibly complex German drivetrain possessed a fatal Achilles heel that would haunt the Wehrmacht until the dying days of the Third Reich. The Panther's final drive housings and transmission gears were originally engineered for a 30-ton tank, not the 45-ton behemoth that Hitler ultimately demanded. Furthermore, as the Allied strategic bombing campaign relentlessly pounded the Ruhr Valley, the quality of German steel plummeted drastically. The lack of crucial hardening alloys, like molybdenum, meant that the gear teeth inside the Panther's transmission were incredibly brittle. If a German driver attempted to reverse too quickly or tried to pivot the heavy tank in deep mud, the transmission would literally tear itself apart from the inside out, shearing the gear teeth and instantly turning the apex predator into a stationary, burning pillbox. This mechanical fragility set the stage for one of the most disastrous combat debuts in the history of mechanized warfare. The ultimate fiery crucible for both of these machines arrived in the scorching summer of July 1943, during the colossal armored clash known to history as Operation Citadel, and specifically the Battle of Kursk. The German High Command had deliberately delayed their massive summer offensive for months, specifically waiting for the new Panther tanks to roll off the assembly lines and reach the front. Hitler was utterly convinced that this new technological terror weapon would effortlessly shatter the deeply entrenched Soviet defensive belts. 200 brand-new Panthers of the initial OSFD variant were hastily organized into Panther Brigade 10, under the command of Colonel Decker and Colonel von Lauscher. But rushing an unproven, highly complex weapon system directly into the most intense combat theater on Earth is a recipe for absolute disaster. We can draw a direct, painful historical parallel to the early deployment of the American M16 rifle in the dense jungles of Vietnam in 1965. The M16 was a technological marvel on paper, but because it was rushed to the troops without proper cleaning kits or adequate field testing in that specific environment, it jammed constantly, costing countless American lives. The Panther suffered a remarkably similar, albeit much heavier fate. Before the German tanks even reached the front lines at Kursk, the massive Maybach HL-230 gasoline engines began spontaneously catching fire. The engine compartments were poorly sealed, and highly volatile gasoline leaked onto the scorching hot exhaust pipes. Dozens of Panthers burned to the ground on the railway flat cars or broke down on the short drive to the assembly areas, entirely due to internal mechanical failures before they had even fired a single shot in anger. When the massive offensive finally kicked off on July 5, 1943, the ground shook as dozens of tanks collided in the largest armored engagement in human history. The temperatures on the vast, unforgiving Russian steppes soared to over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the poorly ventilated steel hulls of the tanks, the temperature easily eclipsed was 120 degrees, turning the crew compartments into suffocating, fume-filled ovens. The southern pincer of the German attack, spearheaded by the elite divisions of General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, slowly but methodically ground its way through the dense Soviet minefields and anti-tank ditches. Despite the horrendous mechanical attrition, the Panthers that actually made it into the fight proved to be terrifyingly effective. The high-velocity 75mm L-70 gun easily punched clean through the frontal armor of the defending T-34s at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The deeply dug-in Soviet anti-tank gunners watched in despair as their rounds shattered harmlessly against the Panthers' sloped glacis plate. The German tactical doctrine of engaging from extreme standoff distances was working flawlessly, systematically picking off the Soviet armor long before the Russians could close the gap. By July 12th, the German armored spearheads had pushed deep into the Soviet defensive network, converging near a small, dusty railway junction called Prokhorovka. Waiting for them was the massive, untouched strategic reserve of the Soviet Union, the 5th Guards Tank Army, commanded by the aggressive and fiercely determined General Pavel Rotmistrov. Rotmistrov faced a terrifying tactical dilemma. He knew intimately that his T-34s, armed with the standard 76.2mm gun, absolutely could not penetrate the thick frontal armor of the Panther or the heavy Tiger tanks at any normal combat range. If he engaged the Germans in a long-range gunner duel across the open steppe, his entire army would be systematically slaughtered in a matter of hours. How do you defeat an enemy who holds an insurmountable advantage in both optics and lethal range? You do exactly what the vastly outgunned American destroyers did at the Battle off Samar in 1944 when facing the massive guns of the Japanese battleship Yamato. You charge directly into the teeth of the enemy, you close the distance at maximum speed, and you turn a calculated, long-range sniper duel into a chaotic, point-blank knife fight in a phone booth. On the morning of July 12, Rotmistrov issued a chillingly simple order to his massive armored armada, Stal, 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 which translates to steel, steel, steel. Over 600 Soviet tanks, the vast majority being the rugged T-34, erupted from their concealed assembly areas and charged full throttle across the open plains directly toward the advancing elements of the IISS Panzer Corps. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the charge kicked up a massive, blinding cloud of dry summer dust that completely blotted out the sun, turning the bright morning into a dark, choking twilight. The German gunners in their Panthers desperately tracked the incoming swarm, their long 75-millimeter guns barking furiously, sending high explosive armor-piercing rounds tearing through the Soviet ranks. Dozens of T-34s erupted into massive fireballs, their turrets blown clean off the chassis by the immense kinetic energy of the German shells. But the T-34s did not stop, they did not slow down, and they did not maneuver for cover. The Soviet drivers, pushing their massive V2 diesel engines to the absolute breaking point, closed the lethal gap in a matter of minutes. The battlefield at Prokhorovka instantly devolved into a swirling, apocalyptic maelstrom of burning steel, choking dust, and point-blank slaughter. By closing the distance to less than 200 yards, the T-34s completely negated the Panther's long-range optical and ballistic advantages. The Soviet tanks aggressively flanked the heavier German machines, pouring fire into the much thinner side and rear armor of the Panthers. The dust was so incredibly thick that visibility dropped to mere feet. Tank commanders on both sides were forced to open their hatches just to see, only to be instantly cut down by a hail of machine gun fire and flying shrapnel. In the blinding chaos, the battle lines completely disintegrated into hundreds of individual, savage duels. When Soviet T-34s ran out of ammunition, or when their guns were disabled, I simply rammed their 32-ton machines directly into the sides of the German Panthers at full speed, crushing the delicate overlapping road wheels and permanently disabling both vehicles in a suicidal embrace of twisted metal. The heavy, complex German beasts were completely swamped by the sheer, relentless volume of the Soviet swarm. The Battle of Prokhorovka was not a clean, tactical victory for the Soviets. In fact, they suffered horrific, disproportionate casualties, losing hundreds of tanks compared to a fraction of that number for the Germans. But strategically, it was the death knell for the German offensive. The Wehrmacht simply could not afford to trade their highly expensive, meticulously engineered Panthers for the mass-produced, expendable T-34s in a brutal war of attrition. The harsh, undeniable reality of the engagement at Kursk sent shockwaves through the Soviet high command. While the T-34 had survived the meat grinder through sheer numbers and suicidal bravery, it was glaringly obvious that the 76.2 millimeter gun was now completely obsolete against the new generation of German heavy cats. The Panther had permanently raised the lethal stakes of armored warfare, and the brutal pragmatists in Moscow realized that if they were going to drive the German invaders all the way back to the gates of Berlin, their beloved sledgehammer needed a massive, deadly upgrade. The brutal, blood-soaked revelation of Kursk forced the Soviet high command to confront a terrifying ballistic reality, realizing that their massive fleet of T-34 tanks was now dangerously undergunned against the heavily sloped frontal armor of the German Panther. The pragmatic engineers in the Ural Mountains did not panic, nor did they attempt to design an entirely new, highly complex tank from scratch that would disrupt their precious production lines. Instead, they executed one of the most brilliant and ruthless industrial pivots in the history of mechanized warfare, fundamentally transforming their expendable sledgehammer into a genuinely lethal medium tank. By early 1944, the massive Soviet factories in Uklian began rolling out the T-34-85, a vehicle that retained the rugged, highly mobile chassis of the original design but featured a massively expanded turret ring, widened from 1,425 millimeters to a robust 1,600 millimeters. This crucial engineering modification allowed the installation of a massive, heavily armored three-man turret, completely curing the fatal ergonomic blindness that had plagued Soviet tank commanders since the beginning of the invasion. For the very first time, the Soviet tank commander had a dedicated cupola with all-around vision blocks. He had a dedicated gunner, a dedicated loader, and a standard-issue radio to coordinate with his platoon. But the undisputed centerpiece of this massive upgrade was the main armament, the devastating 85mm ZSS-53 rifled gun. This weapon was originally derived from a heavy anti-aircraft gun, and it fired a massive 20-pound armor-piercing projectile at a muzzle velocity of over 2,600 feet per second. How exactly does a sudden increase in muzzle energy change the tactical calculus of a tank engagement on the freezing steppes? It changes everything. Because while the 85mm gun still struggled to penetrate the aggressively sloped frontal hull of the Panther at long ranges, it could absolutely punch straight through the flat 100mm thick steel of the Panther's turret mantlet from nearly 1,000 yards away. The T-34-85 completely leveled the tactical playing field, transforming what used to be a suicidal point-blank charge at Kursk into a highly lethal maneuvering gunnery duel where the Soviets could finally trade blows with the German heavy cats. The Soviet crews, now possessing the situational awareness to spot the enemy and the kinetic energy to actually kill them, began utilizing highly aggressive flanking maneuvers, operating in sweeping wolf packs that overwhelmed the numerically inferior German panzer battalions. To truly understand this clash of military philosophies, we can draw a direct, undeniable parallel to the infamous small arms rivalry of the Vietnam War, specifically the American M16 rifle versus the Soviet AK-47. The German Panther, much like the early M16s and 16s, was a triumph of high-end engineering, boasting superior accuracy, incredible lethality, and a highly complex internal mechanism that required meticulous, constant maintenance to function properly. It was designed for a perfect world that simply does not exist in a combat zone. The T-34, exactly like the AK-47, was built with massive mechanical tolerances, designed specifically to be operated by poorly trained peasant conscripts, and engineered to function flawlessly, even when completely caked in freezing mud, blood, and carbon fouling. When you are fighting a war of total apocalyptic annihilation across thousands of miles of unforgiving terrain, rugged reliability will always brutally outpace delicate precision. The German engineers fundamentally failed to understand that the ultimate weapon of war is not the one that performs best on a pristine testing ground, but the one that actually shows up to the fight when the weather is terrible and the supply lines are completely shattered. The catastrophic logistical collapse of the German war machine is where the true, fatal flaws of the Panther design were ultimately exposed for the entire world to see. By the summer of 1944, the relentless clockwork bombing raids of the American 8th Air Force and the British Royal Air Force had systematically annihilated the German synthetic oil refineries at Lina and the massive oil fields of Ploiești in Romania. What exactly happens when an apex predator suddenly runs out of calories? It starves to death, and that is precisely what happened to the German panzer divisions. The massive Maybach gasoline engines of the Panthers were incredibly thirsty, and as the German supply lines evaporated, tank commanders were forced to abandon hundreds of perfectly intact, fully functional Panthers on the side of the road simply because their fuel tanks were bone dry. Furthermore, the fragile final drive systems of the Panther, which had never been properly upgraded to handle the 45-ton weight of the vehicle, continued to shatter under the immense strain of constant, desperate retreats. German recovery vehicles, which were incredibly scarce, were completely unable to tow a broken-down Panther through the thick Russian mud, forcing the crews to pack the interiors with high explosives and detonate their own technological masterpieces to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands. This logistical nightmare culminated in the utter destruction of German Army Group Center during Operation Bagration, launched on June 22, 1944, the exact 3-year anniversary of the initial German invasion. The Soviet High Command, led by brilliant operational minds like Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Konstantin Rokossovsky, executed a massive theater-wide deception campaign known as Maskirovka, completely blinding German military intelligence. When the hammer finally fell, over 2 million Soviet troops, spearheaded by thousands of brand-new T-34-85s, completely shattered the German defensive lines in Belarus. The highly mobile Soviet tank armies drove deep into the German rear, advancing over 400 miles in a matter of weeks, completely severing the rail lines and trapping hundreds of thousands of German soldiers in massive pockets of annihilation. The German Panthers, theoretically superior in a stationary, defensive sniper role, were completely overrun and outmaneuvered by the relentless, sweeping tide of Soviet armor. Hitler's absolute obsession with micromanagement and his delusional orders for his troops to stand fast and hold useless fortress cities turned the highly mobile Panther into nothing more than a static, heavily armored pillbox, completely wasting its tactical potential. We see this exact same strategic dynamic in the American Civil War, specifically during General Ulysses S. Grant's bloody but highly effective overland campaign of 1864. General Robert E. Lee possessed brilliant tactical commanders and often inflicted disproportionate, horrific casualties on the Union forces, much like the German Panzer aces did on the Eastern Front. But Grant understood the cold, brutal mathematics of attrition warfare. He knew that the industrialized North could easily replace its lost men and equipment, while the blockaded, starved South absolutely could not. Grant relentlessly pushed his forces forward, completely ignoring the tactical setbacks, and continuously flanked Lee's army, stretching the Confederate logistical lines until they simply snapped. Zhukov and Rokossovsky applied this exact same American Civil War doctrine, but they executed it with thousands of diesel-powered T-34s instead of infantrymen. They did not care if they lost 5 T-34s to kill a single Panther, because the massive factories in Tankograd were producing 10 new tanks for every one that was destroyed, while the German factories in the Ruhr Valley were being systematically reduced to smoking rubble by American heavy bombers. If we look at the Western Front of World War II, the American military-industrial complex adopted a philosophy that was strikingly similar to the Soviet approach, completely validating the concept of mass production over individual tactical superiority. The American M4 Sherman is often unfairly maligned by armchair historians as a death trap, but in reality it was an absolute logistical masterpiece. The United States Army Ordnance Department specifically designed the Sherman to be highly reliable, easy to repair in the field, and most importantly, perfectly sized to fit into the cargo holds of Liberty ships and the loading cranes of European ports. The Americans could have easily built a heavily armored, 60-ton supertank to fight the German Panthers and Tigers head-on. But how on earth do you transport a 60-tons monster across the Atlantic Ocean and drive it over the ancient, crumbling stone bridges of rural France? You cannot, which is why the American Sherman boasted an astonishing operational readiness rate of over 80%, while the German Panther rarely hovered above a dismal 35%. The T-34 and the Sherman won their respective fronts not because they had the thickest armor or the biggest guns, but because they actually functioned as reliable cogs in a massive, unstoppable logistical machine. As the war ground into the bitter, freezing winter of 1905, and the Soviet armies breached the borders of the German homeland, the once mighty Panther was reduced to fighting a desperate, hopeless defensive action in the rubble-strewn streets of Berlin. The highly advanced, overlapping road wheels of the Panther, which had provided such a smooth ride on the open steppes, became instantly clogged with shattered bricks and concrete debris, completely immobilizing the tanks in the narrow city streets. The long 75mm gun barrel was a massive liability in urban combat, constantly snagging on ruined buildings as the turret tried to traverse to engage Soviet infantry. The T-34-85, with its shorter barrel, wider track, and brutal simplicity, was perfectly suited for the horrific close-quarter street fighting that defined the final days of the Third Reich. The Soviet tank crews, many of whom had fought all the way from the desperate defenses of Moscow and Stalingrad, ruthlessly cleared the German capital block by bloody block, using their high-explosive 85mm shells to systematically level any building that dared to harbor a German anti-tank team. So, when the smoke finally cleared over the shattered dome of the Reichstag and the blood of millions soaked into the ruined soil of Europe, which tank truly ruled the Eastern Front. If you define a great tank purely by its individual tactical lethality, its optical clarity, and its ability to destroy enemy armor at extreme ranges, then the German Panther is undoubtedly the superior machine. In a vacuum, in a perfect one-on-one duel on a flat plain with unlimited fuel and ammunition, the Panther would systematically dismantle the T-34 every single time. But wars are absolutely never fought in a vacuum, and they are never decided by individual duels. Wars are fought in the mud, in the freezing snow, at the end of thousand-mile supply lines, and in the sprawling, chaotic factories of the home front. The T-34 was the ultimate expression of total war, a brutal, unrefined, and perfectly adequate weapon that was produced in such overwhelming, unstoppable numbers that it completely crushed the highly engineered, delicate German war machine under its wide steel tracks. The Panther was a masterpiece of lethal engineering designed to win battles, but the T-34 was a masterpiece of strategic logistics designed to win a war. The harsh reality of mechanized combat is that perfection is the absolute enemy of good enough, and a reliable weapon in the hands of a conscript today is infinitely more valuable than a technological marvel that is broken down in a maintenance depot tomorrow. Thank you for joining us on this deep, forensic dive into the greatest armored rivalry in human history. Now it is time for you to sound off in the comments section and let us know where you stand on this historical debate. Which factor do you believe was the absolute most critical in deciding the outcome of the armored war on the Eastern Front? Was it A, the sheer, overwhelming mass production and rugged simplicity of the Soviet T-34? Was it B, the devastating long-range firepower and heavy frontal armor of the German Panther? Or was it C, the massive, catastrophic logistical failure and fuel shortages of the German High Command? Drop your answer and your reasoning in the comments below, hit that subscribe button, and stay tuned as we continue to dissect the brutal realities of military history.